She'll go live.
I don't know whether anyone saw it, but someone sent me an invitation card of Mukesh Ambani's son's marriage.
Oh, wow.
I don't know anyone has seen it.
Yeah.
I
it
was
is?
told that each invitation card costs ₹1.5 lakh.
That's all.
Yes, and it's an amazing thing. The film itself on the invitation card is about 2.5 minutes. And if anyone is interested, I could send it to. I'll send it to Ujjwala, and Ujjwala, he couldn't send it to others.
Sure,
It's
sure.
amazing. It's absolutely amazing. You couldn't.
All right. So I
Okay.
think let's begin. Thank you everyone for joining in. We're happy to start our first webinar in a three-part series called Understanding Heat Waves and Climate Change, Challenges and Solutions for India. Today, we're going to be talking about how heat waves have become an increasingly severe and frequent threat, especially in urban regions, and especially in our country. And we've seen enough and more news reports over the last couple of months talking about how temperatures have reached breaking points across the country, the number of deaths that have happened due to heat waves as well, and increasing heat stress. Today, we're going to be talking about the science of heat waves, the urban heat island effect, CSE's new report on heat stress. We're also going to talk about the impacts of heat waves on vulnerable stakeholders, and then talk about entry points where NGOs and CSOs can come in. Thank you all for joining in. We would like to first invite Kirtiji to give us a short introduction about INHAF's larger webinar series called Rethinking Cities. Over to you, Kirtiji.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is 114th. Is it correct? It's 114th webinar, and we're doing this for the last 3 years, and I think just about every single webinar, either I or one of my colleagues has introduced. Today, I think we have a small advantage in the sense that we have a small film made on the webinar series, and I suggest let us start with that film, so that and that introduces the whole webinar series, and then of course I'll come back and do a few other things. But uh, uh, can we see the film first?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Doing it. Is it visible?
No, I can't see this.
Chitrakshi?
Ma'am, I'll present.
Ha. I'm doing the screen sharing. It is not visible?
No, ma'am, I'll do. It's
Yeah,
visible,
it's-
ma'am, it's
Urbanization
visible.
holds out both the bright promise of an unequal future and the grave threat of unparalleled disaster. And what it will be depends on what we do today. Unless a revolution in urban problem solving takes place, the future is not very bright.
Cities, drivers of economic change, drivers of dreams and ambitions of billions of people. But with rapid urbanization, cities are already becoming sites of human distress. Cities are also a pivotal opportunity to a transition into a new era of sustainable, equitable development. This is a complex issue and needs to be looked at from different angles and perspectives. Meeting the urban challenge well and in time is critical. if we do not want to sacrifice the quality of life of millions of Indians. The failure of the system and our inability to meet the challenge properly was highlighted during the pandemic. India's dream and goal of achieving a 5 trillion economy cannot be achieved if we cannot plan for the health of our cities. This needs a different approach, a paradigm shift, and that is not going to happen through conventional actors, not by the government alone, nor by the academic community alone, nor even by professionals. This needs a wider, multi-level, multi-dimensional societal partnership. The Habitat Forum, or INHAF, along with over 450 local and international partners, started the webinar series as a response to this need. The webinar series and INHAF's network is a supplementary, complementary effort to think about cities of today and the urban of tomorrow. We looked at the city as a lab, the city as an organism. With over 100 webinars and 500 professionals, civil society and government officials partnering with us, garnering over 1.5 lakh participants. What we are trying to do is set up a context, a new paradigm, a shift of perspective. People were speaking and listening.
नमस्ते, मेरा नाम विमलताई बुलबुले है.
I want to speak with you on the youth issues and youth challenges and youth initiative in this lockdown.
आज तक नाके पे हम लोग जहाँ तक भी हम नाके पे खड़े रहते हैं तो लगभग हम 600-700 आदमी लोग खड़े रहते हैं, उसमें कुछ महिलाएं भी होती है.
And I'm hoping that this webinar will provide us the space for a conversation around some of those issues, a conversation really to begin thinking about these issues.
There were broadly 8 categories we explored: urban poverty, urban mobility, environment and ecology, slums, shelter and affordable housing, rural housing and habitat, urbanization and inclusive cities, strengthening civil societies, education and practice. Equality and inclusivity lies at the heart of INHAF's examination into the subjects.
First, reclaiming the public, because at the end of the day, it's the public space, it's the public institution that we need to think about, which we have forgotten for too long.
We are creating a body of work that you can collaborate with within your schools, your universities, your colleges, and beyond into your professional spaces. Use these webinars and the experience and knowledge that our partners represent to create labs within your college. Make space for conversations and further research into topics that you feel need attention. Use these conversations as a library, as a repository of knowledge, and let us know. We want to engage and work alongside you. Come, join in the conversation. Let us together take this journey of transforming and growing our cities into something that we love to live in.
That we started with this film and that says something. I'm not going to kind of restate what the film has said, but basically speaking, come back and restate the objective. And that is this particular webinar series, which we are doing for last 3 years, and have reached now 114th, and hope to reach somewhere maybe 150 by end the next year, essentially is meant to open the much needed societal dialogue on how we handle urbanization. As this film has depicted so clearly, and I think we believe very strongly that urban challenge is very, very complex. And we as people, we as government, we as civil society, we as professionals have not understood its multiple dimensions, its severity, its complexity. And our inability to understand it, has led to problems in responses. And that has led to the kind of cities that we have. And therefore, we're saying that we need all abilities, all creativities, all knowledge, and there is a lot that is outside the government system. Government system itself has a lot. Civil society has a lot to contribute. Business and industry, the private sector has a lot to say. And what we're saying is this: that this is a small little effort to set up this creative dialogue, which is a one small step, but an important one. To recognize that there is a need for such a dialogue and such a partnership. So that is where we are. I'll just take another 2 minutes to talk about this particular webinar, and that while we're talking about this webinar series, we're doing a good number of activities and projects on mobility and housing and poverty and governance and all that. We also are looking at one city in some depth. We're looking at Chennai. And we thought that if you really wanted to kind of do broad-based this understanding on cities, at least one city you got to understand in sufficient depth. And we thought that if you want to understand a city in the context of its past, its present, and its future, climate change is a very good entry point. And we therefore have developed this particular project in Chennai, where for last 2 years almost, where we are looking at the city and climate change. This project, and I think people who are connected deeply with running and managing project, Professor Raghu Saab and Ujjwala and Joel and others are here. But basically speaking, what we thought was this, that, and because I was talking about past, present, and future, we'll try and understand how is this city going to be affected by climate change. We also, and so in what way climate change would affect the city. And as our intention is to really understand how we're trying to meet this climate challenge. The other thing that we're trying to do is to understand how is city trying to respond to the urban challenge. So, the climate challenge. What is government doing? What is civil society doing? Industry doing? Business doing? Academics doing? So that's a very important part. And that we thought there's not enough just to understand and know who is doing what, but sharing that in order to because then our intention is to build a coalition, build partnership, build essentially dialogue. We also said, how do we reach it out to people what we know? I also thought it's very important to understand how formal system is planning and looking at this entire phenomenon. Because I don't think when they planned Chennai 20 years ago, climate change was such an important factor. Now it's a very important factor. So we're trying to understand how is the master planning processes exercise, projecting cities' growth and development next 20 years, how is that being considered? And of course, try to look at mitigation and adaptation strategies. So it is in that context that we started, and I think Raghu Saab has moderated this 10 episode series of webinars related to Chennai climate change. And today I think is the eighth one. I then try to remember that this 8 webinars that we've done, we started I think in about 4 or 5 months ago, and they took a small break. We have looked at COP28 and urbanization, talked about cities and climate change. We also have looked at urban heat islands earlier, urban transportation, its impact, solid waste and sewerage, and all those kind of things. So today is a very important one, and we have 2 very bright people helping us, Anumita ji and Apeksha ji, to run through this challenge, what is being done, what is needed to be done. And of course, it's not be confined to Chennai alone. But I think I just wanted to say that we are trying to look at the climate change in the context of a city, so that it's handleable. So with that sort of introduction, I hand over to Ujjwala and Raghu Saab conduct the session. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Kirtiji, for both showing the film as well as giving an introduction about the webinar series, which has been so pivotal in bringing together experts and various people across urban areas in the country and talk about issues. Let's jump into the webinar today. Today, we'll be talking about heat waves and climate change, understanding both the risks, the hazards of heat waves, as well as the various solutions and entry points for heat waves. I will first invite Anumita ma'am to present. She is going to be speaking about the science behind heat waves, CSE's report on heat waves that has recently come out. I had the pleasure of attending their webinar recently and actually listening in to their report. She's the Executive Director of Research and Advocacy at the Center for Science and Environment. And I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ujjwala. So let me share the presentation and then I'll begin. Can you see my presentation?
Oh.
Great. So thanks a lot. And I'm very happy that you are actually discussing this issue. And when I was listening to Kirtiji and the statement that he made, that how climate change is impacting our cities. And I just thought that this question does not lie in the future anymore. It is now the lived reality. And we have just been living it this summer in Delhi and many other cities of India. And what is even more disturbing is that even when we thought, and I'm sure when you were planning this webinar, you thought that even today it would be heat wave would be the top news. But it's so surprising that I'm sitting in Delhi right now. Today we had a deluge of rains and the entire city has flooded and the city has come to a standstill. And this just brings out the kind of extremity we are living in, from one extreme to the next extreme. And that's something that we really want to understand today and understand it in the context of the heat wave, which we have just lived. So what we tried to understand when the heat wave was raging in the country, that we talk about climate change. There's a lot of conversation around how global temperature is rising, but there is very little understanding of what is the local manifestation of the same trend. How we feel it locally. How do we experience it locally? What happens exactly? What do the temperatures really look like city after city in India? So we thought, okay, let's do a little bit of deep dive. And then we started sieving through this whole plethora of data set to understand. And we looked at 5 megacities of India first. And we tried to understand that how the decadal summertime ambient air temperature has changed. And we're looking at these 2 decades from 2001 to 2023, how the relative humidity have changed, land surface temperature, change in land use, the green and the blue, your greenery and the water bodies, and then try and understand how the heat hotspots in the city look like. So that's how the whole journey began. And it was amazing insight that we got as we started looking at the data. So first, what really struck us that even though common sensically we say, oh, temperature is rising, but when we look broadly, overall air temperature has increased, but not so dramatically. So when you're looking across these cities, what we find that the temperature has changed, but it's about 0.05 degree of change that you're really talking about. And there is a local variation in that. And what is interesting is that you find that that Mumbai, Bangalore, Chennai, where we see higher increase. But Kolkata is a little bit lower than the other two. But Delhi and Hyderabad, we actually noticed a decline, a slight decline. Overall, the ambient summertime air temperature. So when such a variation is quite noticeable, then what is it? And what is it that making up that heat? Then we looked at the relative humidity. And that's where the drama is. And that's where we are seeing such dramatic increase in relative humidity across all cities. In Hyderabad by 10%, Delhi 8%, Mumbai 7%, Kolkata, Chennai 5%. But what is still that the Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, they're still over 25% more humid than Delhi and Hyderabad. Now, the reason why we are so worried about the rising relative humidity, and that everyone understands that science quite a bit, that what it means in terms of worsening heat stress. And this heat stress, and we understand in terms of heat index, that combination of air temperature and humidity. Now, this is what makes it deadly. We know that how our body cannot adapt to that very easily. Our sweating, our natural system of cooling ourselves, that whole function gets jeopardized. And therefore, the natural cooling is lost. And this is when the doctors tell us that the people suffer the maximum during this kind of heat stress when both humidity and temperature are high. And that's when you see not only illness, but also a lot of fatality, deaths that happen. And this we have seen this time in Delhi, the number of people who have died from heat stroke is huge. And then what is very interesting, so it is just not the peak summer, therefore. So when we compare the pre-monsoon with monsoon, so monsoon is when, very predictably, when you see the heat index higher, and all the cities are showing that trend. But what is most dramatic in the whole data, and what we understood, is that it's just not the overall, but it's a nighttime temperature, which is increasing and substantial. And that's, imagine, therefore, if you really look at that, so in the earlier decade, when the nighttime temperature, so the degree to which it would cool down compared to the daytime temperature during the last decade, that was much less in most of the cities. So in Delhi, for instance, that cooling came down by 9%, in Hyderabad about 13%, Bangalore about 15%, Chennai 5%, Mumbai about 24%. So just imagine that the degree to which the night would cool down, and it used to cool down, is not happening that way anymore. And what the science is telling us, and that's what even IPCC and the Lancet, all the information that is coming out now, that they are saying that this whole excess, this nighttime temperature, that is when, this is what is really making the thing deadly, because this is, in fact, people are dying more during nights. You don't get the relief, the respite to cool down during night. And our ability to adapt to it is much weaker. So the data is extremely stark there. And that's what we really now need to understand. How can policies respond to that? But the question is, so then we said, okay, fine, if these are the trends in the city, then what is contributing to this trend? So then we said, okay, let's do an even deeper dive and try and understand what are the key contributors to this heat buildup. So how the land use is changing, green and blue disappearing, more concrete, more waste heat that we know of. But when you try and understand that with the data, that's when we feel that we really need to understand that how do we what it looks like. So if you really see what is happening in terms of land use change, so if you look at Chennai, the built-up area has doubled in 2 decades and the green cover has shrunk by 14%. Okay, but also what is interesting is that in Delhi, Hyderabad, you actually see green cover increasing. Delhi has seen the maximum increase in green cover, and yet it is really not helping us to cool down enough, especially during night. So what is this all about? So then we said, okay, now let's do a little bit more deep dive and try and understand the hotspots. And then we looked at 9 more cities, and these are in different climatic zones, as you can see here. Ahmedabad in hot, dry, Chennai, Kolkata, Bhubaneswar, and Pune in warm and humid, Delhi, Jaipur, Nagpur, Hyderabad in composite, and Bangalore in temperate zone. So this is where we went, and we first tried to understand that what exactly is happening. So if IMT has a way of defining what is heat wave, and then which is about 40 degrees, that is when you're crossing that. And then we also took the land surface temperature when it is higher by a certain degree. And then these heat centers where we are seeing consistent, the plateau, it's that almost for 6 consecutive years, we are seeing that it is hovering around 40 to 45 degrees in these areas, in these cities. So that's how we started mapping the heat hotspots in all these different cities. And as you can see, that you can clearly see that while the overall hotspot during the summer, but then there is a peak moment. And that's when it is the peak heat, then almost entire city is getting enwrapped in that heat. And that's something that we really wanted to understand, that how extensive is the spread in the city itself. So and that means it's leading to prolonged exposure for the population in those cities, especially those living in those heat centers, the heat hotspots. So when we understood this, we then said, okay, so this now, it's even easier for us now to classify the days during summer, that when is that you need to press the caution button, where you need to say you need to take extreme caution, and when it is a dangerous level. And then we started classifying those days accordingly for these different cities. But clearly, then you try and match the heat spots and with how the green and blue infrastructure is changing in different cities. And it's it's very significant what you're noticing. So when you go city by city and compare the green areas, for instance, between 1999 and 2021, and see the way the green areas have dropped. And this across, and I'm not reading this out, but whether you take Delhi from half to 30%, or Jaipur, or Chennai, where also we have seen the erosion of green cover, Bhubaneswar, Nagpur, Bangalore, Hyderabad, it's a story that is getting repeated across all these cities. Now, therefore, what is the takeaway for the policies that now need to be informed? Now, it's good to see that several policy studies are now coming up where they are now beginning to assess that how, if you try and increase the green cover or the blue elements, then what benefit do you get in terms of moderating the temperature? So this study that, for instance, shows that if you take these different interventions, whether this is the vertical green, water sprinkling, parks, the vegetation, all these different parameters, and the water bodies, then they have estimated the range of degree to which the cooling is possible. This is for the air temperature, the ambient air temperature. But this will also get hugely impacted by the distance from these heat sinks. That will also determine the impact. And then the impact on the land surface temperature. And that is also much more significant than the impact you would see on the air temperature. And here, therefore, as you can see again, of the same interventions, that the range of the degree to which the cooling is possible is substantially lot more. So the data, therefore, is and the evidence, therefore, is very clear that if we act, then we are going to see the impact. But then we found yet another correlation when we went to Jaipur and we divided the city into different grids and tried to correlate that where you have the most polluted grid in the city. And when we identified the most polluted grid and we correlated that also with the local temperature, the land surface temperature, and we actually found them both fitting so well that the pollution hotspots, therefore this is the pollution dome and the heat dome in those areas are fitting so well. Now this is also just not a technical data story. It is a human story. At the end of the day, it is all impacting us and the people living in the city. And when we then started to map that where people live and where your heat hotspots are, then we realized, as we saw this in the case of Kolkata, that 70% of the slums, they fall in the heat-stressed areas of the city. And just imagine, therefore, this whole vulnerable population with very, just no wherewithal, with no means for thermal comfort, and also the fact that the large workforce in India today, especially the urban workforce, they are occupied in heat-exposed occupations, in outdoor occupations. So the implications of all that. So what do we do then? How do we change things? And therefore, what is very important, that while you're mapping the problem, you then need to map the problem with where you need to look for the solution. So then in the same cities, we then started looking at all the key intervention points to understand what does it really mean? What is the evidence on them? So when we looked at the city geometry in terms of building density, city layout, height and size, heat retaining properties in the buildings and materials, the water bodies, vegetation, waste heat, then a lot more insight began to emerge. And then we kind of disaggregated that. So what is contributing to the elements of shading and what is contributing to the elements of exposure? Now, when we started doing that, how your building layout, orientation are like, how do you have the sky view, and what kind level of shading and the canopy you have in your city, and then the heat contributors like the buildings, the impervious open spaces, barren land, and so forth. Now, this is very interesting that today when we say, oh, it is heat, if you have to deal with heat, go and plant trees. But we don't even pay attention to the fact that whether the green that you are going to add to your city is going to be impactful will depend on the type, quality, and the spread of the vegetation. And we went out with a thermometer, and we actually went and started measuring temperature in the shades of different trees. And therefore, as you can see, that unshaded area, when we compared this and the shading, because of the palm tree, because as you know today, in the name of plantation, we are only looking at the ornamental plantation. So why should Delhi have a palm tree? But then when you go and measure the temperature under a palm tree, you see that the temperature levels are much higher than the shading that is provided by a large canopy tree. And these are the kind of interventions. So these are the data that then helps you to bring certain certainty into what is needed. We did the same, but because we say concrete is adding to the heat, but how much? What is adding? To what extent? So when we actually measured the surface, the blacktop part of the bitumen part of the road, and that during when it is sun exposed, and you immediately see how the temperature is jumping. When you look at the red paver tiles, the same story, from 38 degree to more than 60 degree just when it is sun exposed. But when you are measuring the temperature in the grass surfaces, clearly you see a big difference with the concrete surface. And this evidence is so telling. And then when you compare the different morphology of the city, but almost similar compact low-rise morphology, two sites in the city, like in Pune, look similar. But then there is a big difference in the temperature level. And here what you find here is that and what is contributing is the material of the roofing. And that is what is, so therefore, especially in the low-income housing, where you have the tin roof dominates the low-income housing areas, and you realize then the exposure of the vulnerable population and how they are affected. And it is showing up in the temperature, the trapping, that is the heat trapping that is happening in those roofs. So similarly with the sky factor, the amount of shading in the overall, because it's just not about the buildings, but it is about planning your public spaces. And we need to understand what kind of canopy, what kind of shades that you have overall. Dramatic was the parking lots in the cities. Now we know that in most of the commercial areas, where you always find them to be the urban heat island effect, where that is much more hot compared to the surrounding areas. But when we actually went to the large parking lots, and we found that the metal surface of the parked vehicles, how much more heat it is trapping, and that kind of is again very dramatic, and that brings you that we have never paid attention to what kind of shading is needed. So clearly, therefore, the detailing that we are looking for in the urban planning, landscaping, making of the public spaces, doing our buildings right, we have not paid attention to the details, even though broadly we talk about we need more greens and blue, and we need more, the shading, etc. in the city, but not realizing how to integrate that with the policies. So then the final segment, just want to highlight that the current approach, but that because of the heat growing in cities, now several cities have now started to prepare their heat action plans. Now, some reviews have happened of about 37 heat action plans in India. And what you broadly find that they are very generic in nature, largely, and more focused on the emergency response during the heat wave conditions, which is important because you certainly have to build your public health service and public health system to respond to the crisis, the public health crisis during the emergency and when you have the heat episode. But the plans are extremely weak when it comes to longer term strategies to reduce the overall heat load of the city, to do better heat management. And that's where we really have to pay a lot more attention. But then keep in mind that heat action plans, which have just kind of broad plans with no compliance strategy, with no legal backup, these are not legal instruments either, no clear funding attached to them, that these are really not the driver of change at the moment. And yet, there are large policies that are already available in India, which are expected to have a huge bearing on how we are managing heat in the cities, but we have not leveraged that adequately to come up with a comprehensive action plan and an implementation strategy. So you have, for the buildings, the Energy Conservation Building Code, you have the India Cooling Action Plan asking for thermal comfort for all, including the lower income groups. There is the whole urban regional development plan formulations and the model building bylaws, their amendments, which have provided for us to look at all the details that are included there, but we have never been able to find a way of mandating their implementation. The transit-oriented development policy, the environment impact assessments of buildings and townships, they all have provisions that how the greens need to be built in, what should be the green per hectare, what should be the per capita green. In fact, one of the provision is that 30% of the built area to be permeable, and there has to be a minimum requirement of green cover, orientation of building, designing of public spaces, streets, master plans are available, but then we have not seen a clear strategy that how do you make this implementable with absolute compliance. And the big challenge here is that you may have policy, you may have rules, but then there's a huge design deficit in the institutions that are expected to implement them. Now, even though we know that we need to design for permeability, for street orientation, proper shading by vegetation, getting the shading material right, and that the multi-purpose zones that are already provided for in the hawkers and the vendors legislations, all that need common shading, community shades. All these are just ignored. And even when you have ornamental decorative shades being created, these are all dense metal and very low rise, and which are trapping more heat. Even the bus stops in Delhi are all stainless steel during heat wave. Nobody can go and sit on them or stand under them. So clearly, a lot of things are going wrong. And as the study by the Delhi IIT shows in Delhi, 67% of the Delhi streets, when they audited it, they found they lack in adequate shading. So this is how we need to look at, because the whole intervention, therefore, has to be about how do you change the microclimate in the neighborhood and the kind of intervention that you require through all the public space design and design interventions and street design interventions that is ignored. Now, there is some conversation around the cool roof, and it's great to see that Telangana, for instance, has come up with a cool roof policy for new as well as for the existing buildings, and also including the low-cost housing in the cool roof program. But this will really have to be scaled up, and this we have to understand how to do that. So the whole idea of how do you retrofit a city, whether for water elements, and that those are the concerns that we really have to address. But one area where we have completely ignored and we have not even understood enough how to address is the whole waste heat. Waste heat from traffic and the waste heat from our cooling devices, air conditioners. Like, for instance, studies have shown that air conditioners during heat wave can by itself raise the outdoor temperature by more than 2 degrees Celsius. And it's a vicious cycle, therefore. More heat, more AC, more AC, more heat. And therefore, how do you tame this? This is one very clear strategy we really need. So therefore, to conclude, what I would really like to highlight, that this is really the time for us to reinvent urban planning. And we really have to see that how do we build our city for resilience? So while we are promoting compact urban form, need to pay attention to the layout, wind flow, ventilation, green-blue infrastructure, per capita greens, the water-sensitive design, passive design, renewable energy, all that is to get integrated in one framework. The master plans need to prioritize the green-blue infrastructure, and which has multiple benefits of air quality, heat sink, carbon sequestration, water resource augmentation, and that is the comprehensiveness that we need to look at. We need to retrofit for microclimate enhancement, and these are nature-based solutions for which we have to provide the shading, cool roof, cool material, water elements, and so forth. But vulnerability assessment now to have an equity and environmental justice element in our programs will become absolutely critical. And we have to institutionalize heat management with clear fiscal support. One, of course, looking for the dedicated fiscal support where needed, but then all the urban programs and schemes and the funding that is flowing to them, we need the convergence funding formula so that all the fundings for urban planning and design, they need to contribute towards the indicators of heat management. And therefore, to reduce the cooling load, that is something that we have talked about even earlier, that the buildings and the climate appropriate design for buildings, cooling technologies, so that we can really create thermally efficient envelopes have the right orientation, the right clustering of buildings, the ventilation methods, adopt energy conservation building code. All those will have to be brought in, even though they exist. But the framework to make them mandatory, to the framework to ensure that there is a compliance strategy, that's what is very weak at this moment. And the material innovation is absolutely critical. There's a lot of material, the traditional material that we are already using, but then a lot of new materials coming into the market today. And that really requires evaluation in terms of thermal comfort, in terms of efficiency, in terms of heat gain, and disseminate that information and promote a more fusion technology where we are blending the old with the new. And therefore, the final point here is that we may have policies and everything, but there has to be an instrument of accountability. And therefore, even in the urban space where we live, we need a disclosure system, and so that to be able to access all the new incentives that are coming for either for the housing, for buildings, or for any other urban program. Those will really have to be now linked with the declaration of the data of actual resource consumption and the actual performance of the built structure. That is the most important and the defining parameter that we have to ask for. Therefore, to say that just keep in mind that today the warning that has come from IPCC is saying that even if we are able to meet that magic number of stabilizing the global temperature of 1.5 degree, but even if we do that, but we will still have the situation, we will still be in a situation that the heat waves will continue to increase and we are really going to be in a very serious climate and public health emergency. So with that, I'll end here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anumita ji. That was very, very useful because there are a couple of instances that you pointed out, and I would like to, give my little tidbit, especially the instance of, you go to a parking lot and you actually measure temperatures on car surfaces and the metal surfaces. And we have done this exercise in Bangalore as well, and temperatures have come up as even 72, 73 degrees Celsius on these cars. And as soon as you put a cover on it, the temperature drops by 20 degrees. So there's a significant difference in the sort of heat gain and heat retention of various materials. And we don't seem to realize that our buildings actually hold the capacity to retain heat. And we've been feeling, I'm in Bangalore, and we've been feeling nighttime temperatures, especially this summer as well as last summer, like from a personal experience, that they've been incredibly bad. And it's much worse at night because the buildings gain heat slowly during the day and they release heat much slower at night. So there is sort of that retention that happens, this bubble that you end up being in. But thank you so much. I will pass on the mic to Apekshita now. Apekshita is the founder of Heatwatch. She is a journalist and a development sector professional. And she's going to be presenting on the work that she's doing at Heatwatch, the various campaigns that she's leading, as well as what is the effect of increasing heat stress on vulnerable populations and stakeholders. Over to you, Apekshita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ujjwala. I just wanted to check, there were a few questions for Anumita ma'am in case we'd like to take those before I go.
Yes, there's one question where someone's asked where they can find the papers referenced on the slides from your presentation, Anumita ma'am. If you could type out an answer for that. And if there are any current or future central government plans to handle extreme heat waves. We can take the second question at the end of the three presentations.
Right, sure. So I will certainly be, I'll be very happy to share with you, and you can also distribute around the links to whatever we have written and published so far on what we have found. I'll be very happy to do that.
Absolutely, that'll be great. Thank you.
Great, I'll just share my screen. Thank you so much, Anumita ma'am, for this fantastic presentation. Really got a great sense of both the technology as well as nature-based solutions essential to deal with this impact of extreme heat. I wanted to start by asking our audience members, and I know that there are members from Bangladesh, Nigeria, etc., but those in India, if you think this was the hottest summer of your lives. And if you can add that in the chat, or if we can just spend a second thinking about it before I move on.
Hi, Apekshita. Sorry to jump in. Could you speak a little bit louder, please?
Okay. Is this better?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Was I audible? Should I restart? Okay. Great. So just as a recap, this is what India dealt with in the past 4 months. We all know, Anumita ma'am has laid the context. Temperatures crossed over 50 degrees Celsius in various parts of North and West India. Northwest and Eastern India recorded twice the number of heat wave days. There is a little bit of consensus on the next two data points, which is the 40,000 heat stroke cases as well as death toll over 219. And the consensus is that these numbers just present the tip of the iceberg. The real numbers of heat stroke cases as well as deaths are way, way higher than what are reported in the Indian media as well as what the government collects. The impact on economy, of course, has been huge. Just one report points out how the reduction in working hours has led to manufacturing capacity orders being the lowest in the past 3 months. And obviously, there's been a huge impact on the power grid. So on the one hand, are blackouts in especially impoverished areas, and on the other, the International Energy Association finds that there is going to be a 9-fold increase in home air conditioner ownership until 2050. And this study is especially interesting because it says that people are going to collect all their money and choose air conditioners over other appliances in the house. And as development sector workers, policymakers, we have to think about, is heat going to create new forms of debt trap for our population, especially for our low income population? So keep that question of whether this was the worst summer you have dealt with in mind, and think about these statistics which say that heat waves are going to just become worse. There's going to be an increase in severity and frequency of heat waves, as Ujjwala was mentioning towards the beginning of the presentation. IMD itself acknowledges that heat waves are going to get worse. We will have more heat wave days in a particular summer season. And South India, which was until a few years ago exempt from the challenge of heat waves, is no longer going to be exempt. And as we saw this in Bangalore, Kerala as well reported heat stroke deaths this year. South India is also going to face extreme heat, the wrath of extreme heat in the years that follow. So was this the hottest summer of our lives, or was this the coldest summer of the rest of our lives? This is an extremely sad and extremely worrisome, alarming meme, also funny, but also sad, extremely sad and extremely alarming. But this, as climate change becomes severe, as fossil fuel expansion continues, as India continues to rely on coal for its electricity generation, this is unfortunately going to be the truth of our times. But as we all know, there is no climate justice without social justice. And this is where heat and extreme heat especially comes in, because heat is a silent, invisible, and unequal killer. And we have to pay attention to the silent and invisible part, because unlike other hazards such as earthquakes or flooding, the heat is not optical. We all feel it. We feel like we're sitting in an oven. We feel like we're sitting in an oven and somebody is increasing the heat from the outside, but there is nothing optical about heat. And as a result of that, there are no photographs plastered on the front of newspapers to create the impression that this is the biggest hazard of our times. And similarly, it's also an extremely unequal killer, because we have to recognize that various parts of the world, especially India, we live in an extremely unequal society. And there are people, plenty of us, who can completely escape in air-conditioned rooms, and there are those who absolutely cannot. And these are the people who build our cities, who shape our physical environments, from construction workers to delivery workers to street vendors, who are most impacted by heat. And these are the workers that Heatwatch, my initiative, we focus on. Our initiative works at building capacity and conducting training sessions on occupational heat health safety, specifically with worker groups who are most impacted by extreme heat. So we're thinking of workers who work outdoors, and especially workers who work informally, which means that they have no social protection benefits for their work. These are construction workers, domestic workers, street vendors, gig and platform workers. And it's important to sort of employ heat health awareness sessions, because there's a lifetime of internalization that this is how it is. We have to continue working in extreme heat temperatures because no better working conditions are essential. So it's important to conduct these sessions to be able to create awareness and knowledge and learn from workers themselves about the ways they are employing to improve their working conditions. We conduct stakeholder sessions with workers to identify demands, especially those demands that would improve their working conditions on a daily basis. We try to build consensus on these demands, and we try to take these demands through campaigns to stakeholders in government bodies. And of course, Anumita ma'am was talking about policy responses, specifically with the focus of social protection responses. We try to bring in responses from the workers themselves about changes that they would need, that they are recommending in their workplaces. And we try to take this to policymakers so that working conditions, health, etc. could be improved. The next slide shows you a few sessions that we've conducted. Our partners are Ajivika Bureau, Workfare and Free Foundation, the Telangana Gig and Platform Workers Association Union, amongst others. And the next slide is just where I would love for you to hear from construction workers themselves about what the past heat wave has been like for them. So as you heard from the construction workers themselves, we are at a point where extreme heat is a public health crisis. There is no other way to put it. We are in an emergency situation right now. And our research on the impact of extreme heat, especially on the health of construction workers, has shown extremely alarming numbers, especially the kind of illnesses and diseases that construction workers are facing. There are chronic kidney issues, there are fungal infections, there's exhaustion, faintness, dizziness. And these are challenges which have been reported by construction workers themselves. And of course, there are heat stroke deaths. Every construction worker we have met has known at least one or two workers who have died on their construction sites in front of their eyes. And these are challenges that construction workers across the hot parts of India are facing. Similarly, our survey with over 140 gig and platform workers has found that 46% of them are experiencing heat exhaustion, and almost half of them lack the means to get a diagnosis and treatment for the challenges that they are facing. Heat, as we all know, is a question of place, is a question of identity, and women are increasingly invisible. It's been extremely hard for us to reach out to women to understand the challenges that they are facing. And the few women that we've managed to reach out to through our work, they have reported an alarmingly high number of urine infections and menstrual health issues because of the challenges that at the workplace, as the construction worker women in the video were talking about, there is absolutely lack of access to toilets, which means that they are forced to either not drink enough water, or if they are drinking water, they are forced to hold their urine and not use washrooms, which increases the chances of urine infections. And you have already heard a bit of this from Anumita ma'am, but we are absolutely woefully unprepared to deal with this extreme public health crisis that we're currently facing. The first point that I want to drive your attention to is that heat waves are not declared as a disaster under the National Disaster Management Act of 2005. A few states in India, such as Kerala, recognize heat waves as disaster, which means that the state disaster management fund kicks in when they want to provide compensation. But other than that, because there is no national declaration of disaster, there is a lack of funding mechanism for heat waves. And there is also a lot of discussion amongst worker groups about the need to declare this as a disaster, especially because if heat waves are declared as a disaster, then there is a certain amount of compensation the government would have to provide people who die because of heat strokes. But that too is not a very easily solvable problem, because the definition of heat wave itself needs revising according to multiple researchers. And what we know is that, yes, IMD recognizes a heat wave if temperatures are 40 degrees Celsius in plains, 37 degrees Celsius in coastal areas, 30 degrees Celsius in hilly areas. But what about humidity? What about other aspects that we need to consider when it comes to declaration of heat waves? And until this is included in the definition, we will never have the true picture of what is a heat wave. When temperatures are around 37, 38 degrees Celsius with 75% humidity, that's as much a heat wave as when temperatures are over 40 degrees Celsius. So there has to be work done to revise and consultations to revise the definition of heat waves. Again, there is lack of consensus on what is a heat stroke death. At the moment, there are multiple agencies from NCRB to the National Disaster Management Authority that are recording heat wave deaths in their own form, in their own manner. There's a lack of standardization of what is a heat stroke death. Plus the new guidelines that have come out from the Ministry of Health and Planning, Health and Family Welfare also put in very strict conditions on what should be a heat stroke death. And local doctors complain about lack of facilities in their hospitals to be able to conduct those tests, to be able to declare that a person is actually dying because of a heat stroke or an underlying cause. And in absence of a consensus on what is a heat stroke death, and absence of training to local health practitioners on what needs to be certified as a heat stroke death and what cannot be, we will never have the true picture of the kind of impact heat waves are having on our country. The case of Delhi's Mungeshpur, where temperatures were recorded over 50 degrees Celsius, and the immediate response from the government was that this is incorrect and these are not the temperatures that Mungeshpur is recording. There is plenty of local evidence and automatic weather stations where temperatures of this nature are recorded. And therefore, we need to increase our investment into local monitoring, into local temperature recording, to be able to effectively understand what hyperlocal temperatures are really like. And finally, heat action plans. I don't want to dwell too much. Anumita ma'am has already covered it, but given the lack of local context in heat action plans, and without real social protection, what kind of guidelines are really present and available to look after the 70 to 80% informal workers in India who are exposed to extreme heat? So our work at Heatwatch really looks at foregrounding social protection and foregrounding the challenges that outdoor workers are facing. And this is an example of some of the demands that we have through consultation with workers, by building consensus, by identifying solutions that they themselves are championing, taken to government bodies. And these include some of the demands, some of the challenges that I've already spoken about: declaring heat waves as a disaster, making basic amenities such as water and hygienic toilets available, because these to this day remain absent. building urban planning measures, this has been spoken about in depth, but we need shaded areas, we need cooling centers, we need green spaces. And we need this especially from the perspective of workers who are spending a majority of their time outdoors. When we asked platform and gig workers what they use to protect themselves from extreme heat, we got answers like they try to stop, like bike delivery workers try to stop under a bridge to prevent the extreme heat from the sun. So there are really no places for workers to rest in between their work duties. And this problem is getting more and more extreme as heat is getting more and more extreme. And finally, one demand that has been consistent across outdoor workers is there is a need to declare a mandatory break between the hours of 12 and 4 p.m. These are hours when the heat is at its peak, and these are hours when chances of heat stroke are at its highest. So these are the hours when there has to be a mandatory break, but without loss of pay, because these are workers who they're daily wage workers, and there's absolute lack of social protection. Early warning systems and mandatory heat awareness training is essential. Like I said, there's a need to not just provide knowledge and information to workers about how to deal with heat, but also learn from them and champion and institutionalize ways in which workers themselves have been trying to deal with heat. And
Hi,
finally,
Apekshita. Sorry,
yes.
There's a comment saying that they can't hear your audio. I can hear you clearly.
I can also hear. She's quite audible.
All right.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, and finally, healthcare facilities such as insurance, medicines, and protective equipment. This again is the responsibility of both workplaces as well as the government to ensure that workers who are risking their lives in outdoor heat are protected. And there have been interesting innovations such as the parametric health insurance initiated by SEWA, but we need these efforts need to be scaled up for us to be able to satisfactorily and coherently be able to protect outdoor working populations. So what can we do about some of these challenges? There are quite a few things that we as citizens, as civil society can do to make sure that we are able to mitigate and adapt to some of these challenges that exist. There are opportunities for us to collaborate here, to work with different outdoor groups. I mentioned construction workers, I mentioned gig and platform workers, domestic workers, there are street vendors, there are multiple types of outdoor groups who need awareness, who need health checkups, who need basic facilities to be able to satisfactorily do their work outdoors. And we need that kind of collaboration to come in. We need a stronger, larger public movement to be able to amplify our voices and demand the government to declare heat waves as a disaster and set up administrative funding processes so that we're able to plug those gaps that exist with heat action plans. And finally, we need data. We don't have enough data to be able to say how many people are affected because of deaths in India. So we at Heatwatch are conducting data sprints, we're conducting sessions to be able to gather some of this data on how many people are falling ill and how many people are dying because of heat strokes. Because once we have the number and the severity of the problem is already apparent, it will become increasingly more apparent, and change would then perhaps be within reach. We'll stop here.
Thank you, Apekshita. That was really interesting. And it's really heartening to know the sort of, work that's happening both at the grassroots level as well as from the top-down approach. Because like they say, heat is an invisible disaster. And it affects the most vulnerable in our urban areas. And it's sort of difficult to go beyond the heat action plans that are sort of mandated and that Anumita ma'am also spoke about, which are very reactive in nature. And I think Raghunandan sir will talk about this a little bit more in his presentation. But thank you, that was really great. I would like to now invite Raghu sir to present. He will be talking and speaking about the heat action plans, the efficacy of heat action plans in the country. What are the various responses that have come up, as well as what are the ways ahead and entry points for various NGOs and CSOs to come in. Over to you, Raghuji.
Thank you, Ujjwala. Let me share my presentation and see if that works. Is that working now?
Yeah.
Yes, Raghuji, if you could just present.
Yeah, is that all right?
No, we can only see the smaller screen.
That's not full screen?
It's not full screen yet, no.
Chitrakshi, you want to try that? I thought it was full screen. It's showing full screen on my.
Chitrakshi, are you there?
Yeah, this is
Yes, this is full screen.
This is full screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much to both my old friend Anumita and to Apekshita for their presentations. I think Anumita brought out the various complex factors behind not just extreme heat, but extreme heat in urban contexts. And Apekshita, I think, brought out very clearly the kind of stresses and health impacts on several categories of the poor, particularly those engaged in outdoor work and construction work. So what I will be doing is to talk about potential responses to this, both from the side of the government and from civil society or NGOs. Hello. Yeah. Okay. So when speaking about urbanization and climate change or the problem of extreme heat in urban areas, we have to realize that we are dealing on the one hand with rapid and unplanned urbanization and the fact that the impacts of heat in cities are a compound of effects of urbanization and of climate change. Both these combine to create the kind of issues and problems that we are dealing with. We know that climate change adds about 1.5 Celsius to normal temperatures, and of course, which rises during heat waves. And in cities, due to the creation of the cities and continued urban expansion, green areas, open spaces, and water bodies are all really sacrificed at the altar of real estate and the expansion of urban areas, which are characterized by high population densities, which also contributes to heat, and to a large vulnerable population who live in congested, poorly ventilated, informal settlements, as brought out in that slide from Kolkata that Anumita showed us. In cities, concretized infrastructure, concretized buildings, tarmac on the roads, all these absorb heat and slowly release them, particularly at night, into the urban environment, which makes cities hotter than surrounding areas. Added to this is what we call waste heat, which is heat released from air conditioners, which cool the insides of the building, but exchange that for hot air, which it vents outside. Cars, which are heat enough and keep radiating this heat out into the environment, and other machinery, all of which together add very large amounts of heat to the urban environment. On top of this, the unplanned urban form, high-rise buildings, etc., which are all built in a haphazard manner, disrupts wind flow, it traps the heat, and also traps air pollutants. In our project in Chennai, for example, there have been reports over the last several years that the famous sea breeze, which used to cool the city of Chennai, is virtually not felt in many parts of the city because those routes for that cool breeze from the sea have been sealed off by the high-rise structures and random orientation of buildings. So all these together form what we call urban heat islands, or UHI, which add somewhere between 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius to city temperatures. Also, the heat inside these concrete structures, roads, the buildings which have been absorbed during the day gradually are released at night, which is the reason why you get higher minimum temperatures in the city and don't get the kind of cooling which you would get in the hinterland, in the suburbs, because you have non-paved streets, you have green areas, soil to absorb the heat and not radiate it back out. Additionally, the point that was just made by Apekshita, humidity adds a very dangerous aspect. A wet bulb temperature, which is a temperature of a thermometer wrapped in a wet cloth, which tells you the effect that evaporation can have on lowering the temperature. And if the humidity is very high, then evaporation hardly takes place and produces no cooling effect. So a wet bulb temperature of 38.5 degrees Celsius is designated by the World Health Organization as almost the limit of survivability of human beings. And if you see a coastal city like Chennai, etc., then a 38.5 degrees wet bulb temperature, which means high humidity, is pretty close to what you get if you have mid-30s temperatures with high humidities, with urban heat island adding another 4 degrees to it, you're getting very close to 38.5. In fact, during this heat wave, which we had just the last 2 weeks, temperatures in Delhi were 45 degrees Celsius plus. Temperatures in Chennai were in the mid to late 30s, between 35 and 38, etc., but with high humidity. And for 3 weeks or so, even when temperatures in Chennai were 35 or so, the heat index, which is a combination of temperature and humidity, was higher than in Delhi, which meant people in Chennai felt the heat more than people in Delhi, which was recording very high temperatures. So these two diagrams show you roughly what we are talking about. The diagram on the left is a map of India showing the patterns of heat. You'll see the orange parts showing the high heat areas. And you will not be surprised to see that all the major cities, Delhi, Barmer, Ahmedabad, Bhopal, Nagpur, are shown in darker red colors, which means they are hotter even than the surrounding hot areas in India, both in the northern plains as well as in the peninsula. And on the right, the picture shows you how the concrete structures absorb heat, how they radiate heat back from the road surface, and how trees or greenery can, by evaporation, cool down the surrounding atmosphere, as do water bodies like rivers or ponds or lakes or whatever. So the heat wave impacts in urban areas, which would show that rather than piecemeal reactions, systemic responses are required to tackle these. So the heat wave impacts include health risks, and we've seen that these are increased morbidity and also increased mortality. And so far, we have had reports of something like 1,100 or 1,200 deaths from heat, but experience shows us that actual mortality could be easily 100 times that or 10 times that because of the lack of reporting, lack of knowing what exactly is a death from heat stroke, etc. The other major risk is exacerbating of cardiovascular ailments, pressures on the heart, breathing difficulties, which are caused by the body not being able to cope with high temperatures. The body sweats, But if sweating is inhibited, your body tries very hard to sweat, which then puts pressure on the cardiovascular system. And then a factor which is not very often spoken about is the impact of heat waves on productivity because of the health issues, on livelihoods, and generally, therefore, on the economy itself. If everybody is working less or working poorly or not able to work to their capacity, obviously the economy is going to be affected. Then there is a strain on the infrastructure. The health system is affected. It's not able to cope. It's put under strain. Then there is an overloaded electricity supply system, the power system, because as the heat grows, more air conditioners come on, more demand for power is there. The system may not cope with it. Then there are blackouts or grayouts, outages in power. And if you have shortages in power, it also affects infrastructure. It affects water supply. It affects water treatment. It affects sewage treatment, all of which are dependent on a continuous and regular supply of electricity, which may be affected by extreme heat. Then there is environmental degradation as well. We saw that when an urban heat island traps heat, it also traps air pollution, which could have gone out of the urban areas if good airflow had been there. But that being inhibited, the pollution also is trapped and stays indoors. So while the common idea is that in winter the pollutants stay low because of an inversion factor and the cold air keeping pollutants down, in the city environment, extreme heat caused by the urban heat island also traps the air pollution and keeps the pollution levels high. And extreme heat also may deplete water sources, particularly in rivers. Delhi is finding that problem because we get water from the nearby areas, which is less available now because everybody needs more water, including the agricultural sector. And if your water supply is dependent on surface water, on lakes and tanks, etc., clearly that would also be affected because of additional evaporation and depletion of those water sources. Now, response to all this has been, and this Anumita spoke about, and so did Apekshita. I will go into a little more detail on this. Almost all states now, several districts, and even a few cities have heat action plans. Now, this started off, you can see here a photo of the Ahmedabad heat action plan in 2014, which was the first and pioneering example of this. And this then triggered an idea, and the National Disaster Management Agency has prepared a set of guidelines for heat action plans. And these guidelines were then meant to be used in other states, districts, cities to prepare their own more localized heat action plans. So now, as I said, almost all states have them, but these are extremely varied in terms of what they cover, how serious they are, what kind of implementations they have. So I'll talk a little bit about that because this today is the official framework for response to extreme heat and heat waves. The components of a heat action plan are, first, early warning systems. You know that the heat wave is coming, and then you give warning about that, saying 2 days from now, temperatures are likely to cross 45 degrees, so be prepared for extreme heat. Now, the maximum warning that's given is normally a few days because you can't really make serious warnings. But very early on, you can say after 2 weeks, you're likely to see high temperatures. But early warnings can be given in this. And then each state has a yellow warning, orange warning, and red warnings based on severity of the heat, on which then different measures can kick in. The second is public awareness campaigns to make the public aware through advertisements in the newspapers, advertisements on television, messages on social media, etc. And the third and a major component which many states implement is capacity building, particularly of the health system. So they convene meetings of the health centers, health departments, communicate what is required to be ready for heat waves, what kind of preparedness you need. In Delhi and other cities, they cleared at least 2-3 beds in every hospital just for heat wave patients. The problem with this, of course, is that this is focused on the health centers, but depends on patients who come to the health centers, by which time it may already be quite late for many people. And the mechanism to link up community level action with preparedness of health centers is not particularly strong at the moment. There are some mild suggestions. I say mild suggestions because they are not of a mandatory nature, nor are they very strongly suggested. There are suggestions in the heat action plan saying, please undertake some greening in your areas, plant some trees and have some parks, etc. And then there are community engagements, some small programs of community awareness, etc., conducted by appropriate government agencies. And there is some guidance for vulnerable workers. I'll underline some guidance because it's not much, it's not systematic. But during this heat wave, for example, you had varying levels of instructions, suggestions, but not mandates to say construction working hours should be staggered and that preferably workers should be asked to work between 8 and 12 in the morning and 4 to 7 in the evening, and take a break between 12 and 4, preferably with some shaded area provided nearby with drinking water and so on. But there was almost no mechanism to ensure that this suggestion gets implemented, nor was there compulsion behind these. We were working in Chennai. We were able to work with some responsible big construction companies like the Metro Rail Corporation, who did implement this, and some builders who are in a sense organized sector builders and not the unorganized sector, who are quite happy to do this and say, look, during the heat hours, workers can work indoors. If they don't have indoor work ready yet, we'll give them a break outside. But that is rare. Yeah. So I would just like to point to what are the gaps and limitations of these heat action plans, some of which I spoke of earlier. The first and major one to my mind is the heat action plans are reactive. My understanding is this is largely because they have been prepared by the National Disaster Management Agency, which by definition is reactive. An earthquake happens, the NDMA reacts. A cyclone comes and the NDMA reacts. So the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Agency, treats heat waves as episodic. They are events which happen and go. So an earthquake comes and it goes. A heat wave comes and it goes. And during that time, you do some emergency action and move. However, extreme heat should be viewed as a slow burn phenomenon, particularly because of climate change. It's not something that's going to happen overnight and disappear overnight. We know that heat waves are going to increase. They will come earlier in the season than they used to. They will be of higher temperatures and they will have prolonged duration. So these are not one-off shots, but they are longer term. And the actions you take to ameliorate conditions, as well as even some preventive measures, for example, to bring down temperatures in urban areas, are long-term actions. So treating heat waves as episodic is not helpful. They should be viewed as slow burn phenomena. They need long-term measures and they need multi-dimensional approach. We've seen that their impacts are on health, on productivity, on infrastructure, on the environment. No one agency or department of the government through just one action is going to be able to tackle all these issues. It requires a multidimensional approach and therefore requires the joint working of a variety of government departments responsible for different aspects of this. The second and a major point, and I think Apekshita referred to this, currently all the heat action plans kick in on the basis of what is declared as a heat wave officially. And there is a very rigid definition of heat waves, which is first you must cross 40 degrees Celsius. And on top of that, the temperature should be between 4.6 and 6.4 degrees more than the long-term average. Either that or temperature should cross 45 Celsius, which is modified to 37 in coastal areas, the 40 that is, or to 30 degrees in the hill regions. The problem with this is effects of extreme heat start kicking in at 42, 43. The human body starts reacting badly and is unable to cope. So even if temperature is not 45, or if it's 40, but it is not 4.6 degrees higher than last year, but it is 2 degrees higher, the effect of heat wave has already started impacting on people's health. Plus, there is no taking into account of humidity. So humidity also ought to be built in. Now, our recommendation is that instead of using a pure temperature-based definition, we should use what is called a heat index. A heat index is used by many countries, many circumstances around, which is a combined index, which combines what is temperature and what is temperature and humidity and gives you an equivalent. It's a kind of a XY graph which combines these. You read off for this temperature, this humidity, what is the impact of that, how much. So if you use heat index rather than temperature as a kickoff, in many cases, you're likely to declare a heat wave at just 40 or 41 degrees Celsius, provided humidity is high, like it was in the city of Chennai. And then you can kick in graded responses. When temperatures are nearing 38, 39, but with high humidity, or just touch 40 with medium humidity, you can start a set of measures. When it reaches the hard level of heat action plan or of heat waves, you can kick in with more serious measures, make things compulsory, etc. And when it has crossed 45 and really is threatening to breach all things, you can kick in with emergency measures. So a graded action plan linked with a heat index seems to be the best solution. Of course, localized actions would be very useful, but I think given capacity limitations of local bodies, local self-government, maybe that's a little over-ambitious at this stage. We can go with a slightly better response method, maybe at the district level or the city level, using heat index and a graded response. The third major area of weakness in heat action plans is most of the heat action plans mention vulnerable groups. They say elderly are vulnerable, infants are vulnerable, pregnant women are vulnerable, those doing outdoor work are vulnerable. Fine. Question is, if you identified these as vulnerable groups, what do you do about it? Specific to these groups. You've just mentioned these vulnerable groups and you've left it like that. Question is, there should be a more detailed identification of vulnerable groups. For example, none of the heat action plans today mentions gig workers. And we've had big problems in cities with delivery workers who deliver food from restaurants to people's homes, Swiggy, Zomato, with the delivery agents fainting because they are told to make at least 10 deliveries in a day. They are out under the sun on their motorcycles and they have had problems. There is no control, there is no regulation, there is no help. When people have approached these delivery companies, they've said, yes, we are aware, we are taking action, but we have not seen anything happen so far. So there are many unidentified or properly identified vulnerable groups, including domestic maids who go from house to house in areas, out in the open again, who are not included. And that gives you, if you identify vulnerable groups properly, it gives you a route map for action. Then you know you have to target gig workers. Then you can approach the gig companies, work for regulation and bring about. Same with construction workers. Same with domestic maids. You can talk to the resident welfare associations and tell them to stagger the working hours, etc. You also need to do some mapping of these. Anumita showed you the map of Kolkata. If you know areas where vulnerable sections are clustered, then you could do targeted outreach programs in those areas, do more awareness, try and identify likely victims and address them in their homes before they reach a level before they need hospitalization. I will only say that I think a lot of us, voluntary organizations, civil society groups, have very recent memories of the COVID pandemic. And all of us worked in communities, in local areas, doing precisely this, acting as outreach agents for health centers, identifying vulnerable groups, identifying potential victims, taking action there, and taking response to the households rather than waiting for households to reach the health centers. So there should be a proper identification of vulnerable groups, proper geographical location and mapping of clusters, and there should be a matrix of vulnerabilities versus protection measures. What do you do if this happens to this group? How do you target this group and what are the protective measures you use there? For example, for construction workers, we have said shift them indoors or give them a break between 12 and 4, provided shaded areas, provide them shaded areas with good, clean, cool drinking water, etc. And lastly, there is no outreach mechanism in these heat action plans. You've got health centers, you've got people in their homes or at their work sites, and there is no mechanism to connect the two. And this is a big gap. 3 more limitations I'll speak of briefly. The first is that the executive responsibility for implementing heat action plans is currently very vague. Nominally, the State Disaster Management Agency is supposed to be in charge. Now, at the union level, at the federal level, the National Disaster Management Agency has got good powers. It comes directly under the Home Ministry, and the Home Ministry is a very powerful department of the government, and therefore is able to mobilize all the other ministries to assist. This is not true of the State Disaster Management Agency, which is a small department in one corner of the state government, not necessarily a major actor. Therefore, in the states, you are seeing very few signs of coordinated action. And some lessons for this, again, could be learned from the COVID period, when many states had set up COVID war rooms, where different department heads all sat together in one room, which is like a control room, and took response out to the city. And some such thing could be done when extreme heat and heat waves are declared. Then there is no legislative framework or legal backing to any of this, which is a huge handicap, which also means that there is no particular incentive for officials to take on these additional tasks. Every official is doing his own bit wherever he is sitting, and then when a heat wave is declared, he has to do something extra over and beyond what he is doing. There's nothing to make that happen. So the inertia of a bureaucracy kicks in. And coordination is, of course, affected. Also, if there were a legislative framework or legal backing, and Apekshita spoke about this, there is a list of disasters declared under the National Disaster Management Authority. Heat wave, cyclone, cyclone, earthquake, floods, landslide, etc. Heat wave is not one of them. So if you had heat waves included as one of the natural disasters under the NDMA, it would open the door to some flow of funds for action in that regard to the states. In India, we know well that currently there is a great imbalance between the financial strengths and abilities of the federal or union government and that of the states. And this also ties in with that. And lastly, implementation of the heat action plans has been very patchy. And that was shown during this heat wave as well, linked with all the above factors we have spoken of. Therefore, the heat action plans, if you read them, there'll be 20 or 25 different suggestions. They largely remain a wish list. Throw green areas, do this, provide drinking water and ORS. But if there's nothing to implement these on the ground, then they are just nice ideas, but they don't. And lastly, you need to institutionalize linkages with community level organizations for outreach of this. Last 3 points I'll mention about the limitations. Intervention measures are suggested, which are, again, like I said, menus of options which are given, but they are not mandatory, and we don't know even how much these recommendations work. For example, cool roofs is something that is talked about a lot these days. However, cool roofs work when you have a 1 or 2 story building. So cooling the roof makes a difference to 1 story below it and below that. But nowadays, even in resettlement buildings, resettling slum dwellers or informal settlements, buildings are 8 stories high, 9 stories high. So cooling down the roof on the top floor doesn't do much to the buildings lower down. However, you have got these codes for buildings, including of low income groups, which can keep the temperatures down. However, at the moment, these codes are not mandatory, they are recommendatory. And one of the things we are pushing for example, especially in Chennai, is to initiate the incorporation of the building codes for residential buildings and make them mandatory at the earliest, which would help. Secondly, longer term measures for resilience are not emphasized. There's a broad recommendation to plant trees, but you need systematic greening of the urban areas if you want to reduce urban heat islands by promoting well-distributed green cover with access to all sections of the population, and to introduce measures to reduce waste heat. And these last 2 aspects I will speak more about in the next webinar when we will share our experience in Chennai city. As I said, there's no provision for funding right now. And lastly, the suggestions for vulnerable sections are very weak for the different categories I've spoken of: gig delivery workers, street vendors, domestic maids, the elderly, the homeless. Out of all the deaths we've had in Delhi, the highest cohort of deaths we have had is for the homeless, with no one really taking care to see that the homeless are taken to some shelter where they are cooled during the night. It has not happened, and we've had a large number of deaths among the homeless, which is extremely painful to note. So I believe that the weaknesses and gaps we have identified provide entry points for NGOs and for civil society organizations to take actions as well as for advocacy. First, I think each NGO or CSO, and we had a discussion just a couple of days ago with a group of about 10 or 12 civil society organizations working in cities on heat issues, and we've decided to coordinate to do some of these. The first is to conduct a detailed study of the respective heat action plans in whichever states we work, identify the gaps and weaknesses, and take steps to try and fill in these gaps, working with the concerned authorities, the state disaster management agency or other departments of the government. From there, to identify feasible points of direct intervention, that places where we can intervene, like working in communities, or working to strengthen health systems, or working to strengthen interaction with the labor department on construction sector, etc. The third is to build coalitions of stakeholders. This was suggested by Apekshita as well. To build coalitions of stakeholders, there are unions or associations for gig workers, for informal sector workers, for street vendors, to work with those and draw up and prepare plans well in advance for the extreme heat season, if not this year, for next year. And we should start this maybe even towards the end of this year rather than waiting till very late next year. Then to work with government agencies to strengthen the NDMA guidelines and the heat action plans. It is learned that the National Disaster Management Agency is in the process of revising its national level guidelines, and they hope to be out with this revised guidelines. There are several NGOs working with the NDMA to strengthen that, and if we can work together to add strength to this advocacy effort, that will help and will filter down to the heat action plans in different states. Then we need to work towards interventions. There are some things we can do directly as NGOs and CSOs at the community level, provide local solutions. As I said, we'll share some of these with you at our next webinar from our experience in Chennai. And we can set up monitoring and preparedness system to provide local relief measures in cases of extreme heat. Then, of course, we can engage in policy advocacies to strengthen the heat action plans and other measures in urban areas to change both the patterns of urbanization and to reduce urban heat island. And we can work with local health centers, building on the experience many of us have had during the COVID pandemic to strengthen preparedness and response measures. And lastly, there are, I think, other broader linkages this opens up. India, along with other countries, is expected to submit upgraded NDCs to the COP by mid-2025 to raise the level of ambition as all nations are expected to. And under those circumstances, when the government is likely to be looking for areas where they could step up emission reductions from urban areas could be included as no risk, no cost options. Energy efficiency in ACs and other appliances, greening, low-cost buildings, energy efficient buildings, etc., which have co-benefits in many other sectors. And lastly, India may also be expected to prepare for the COPs and for discussion in the COPs, national adaptation plans. And urban adaptation or adaptation in urban areas could play a major role in this, particularly with regard to heat. Thank you very much. I'll stop.
Thank you, Raghuji. That was very insightful. And as you've rightly mentioned, heat action plans are, firstly, they don't have any legal backing, and they're very large scale in nature, at the same time targeting individuals to sort of react to heat waves rather than actually developing adequate mitigation systems and putting those in place. So we very well know that heat action plans are also not even, they're not even well known in multiple cities. For example, in Bangalore city, at one of the primary health centers that we visited, none of the nursing staff or the doctors even knew about any heat action plan that existed. They didn't know about any protocol that existed as well. And Karnataka does have a state heat action plan, which has been released. So it's a little scary to know that these are currently our only way forward in actually dealing with increasing heat stress, as Apekshita mentioned and showed us the meme, which is really scary. And we've been seeing this meme sort of pop up on social media quite a bit recently. It's only going to get worse. So thank you for pointing out to all the three panelists. Thank you for pointing out the what heat waves actually mean, what's actually happening in our cities, how they're affecting the vulnerable populations, and what are the measures currently in place and how they're inadequate in nature. There are two questions which are pending. One is for Anumita ma'am. The question is, are there any current future central government plans to handle extreme heat waves? Which organizations are in charge of such research? So I think the first part of the question has been handled, which is the current government plans. But what about future plans and what organizations are currently in charge? Over to you.
So clearly, as Raghu has already explained, that at this moment it is seen within a very limited scope. And as a result of that, heat action is seen as a disaster preparedness and disaster management. And therefore, it is with the disaster management agency, which Raghu has explained so well. But as we have also understood that heat management is a much more complex and it's a very multidimensional issue. And therefore, this requires to be addressed from different perspective and different angle. And already there are multiple policies that I've already mentioned. So there's one bucket where you have the whole range of policies and regulations around the built structure. That how do you make the buildings, how do you make them energy efficient, how do you make thermally comfortable? So now that is with the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, that is with at the central level. For the regulation development, for implementation, it is the urban local bodies who then have to translate that rule into the local bylaws and make it part of the building approval. And but then that is building centric. In addition to that, there are the urban planning approaches. So which means how you're designing the street, how you're designing your public places, how you are providing infrastructure. Now, these are all therefore dealt with by different agencies. So which essentially means that the responsibility and the solutions are so distributed and there's so many departments involved that it is more important, therefore, to focus on that what will be that integrated framing of policy that will align their action. So all of them might be doing things in fragments, but we have to align it, see the convergence happening. And based on that, you have to develop your action plan. So heat action plan is not what Raghu just explained. It should not be so limited in scope. So the mainstreaming of it and to then mainstream the indicators of what makes the heat action plan and how different departments need to align, get involved, and then develop their budget line and ensure the fund flows. That will be the critical intervention.
Yes, absolutely. I think there needs to be a systemic approach towards actually coming up with a heat action plan that is implementable, because we were working at the ward level in Bangalore City, and the fire department has to deal with increased number of fires due to increasing heat. But there is no alignment with the primary health center that has to deal with increasing heat stress and heat stroke cases. There is no alignment with other responses to concurrent disasters as well, because heat is not the only disaster that's going to happen due to climate change. There'll also be flooding. There's also going to be a water crisis, which Bangalore City faced. And we can see this happening across the country. So I completely agree with you. There has to be sort of this alignment between different agencies, a framework for collaboration, which needs to come up. All right, thank you. Apekshita, you have a question. They've asked whether, have you also gotten data on the effects on children and different age groups and social classes through your work?
Unfortunately, no, we have not collected data on specifically the impact of heat on children. This is something that we were trying to do, especially with construction workers, because in a lot of cases, in absence of creche facilities, children often accompany their parents on construction work sites. So we are trying to understand the impact of heat on children, but at the moment, we don't have data on that.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. I think through a little bit, just to add to that, there is, I think, very little data on how heat affects children, because they're also not, they don't fall under vulnerable stakeholders that are interviewed directly in studies. So I think it's a little bit difficult to also have access to their perceptions around heat. it's only through their family members or parents who will be able to tell us. But I think definitely, I remember like changes in school timings when I used to study in Kanpur during the summer were a sort of thing. We were taught disaster management, but never about heat. It was always sort of this thing around earthquakes or other disasters, which were more common. And I think also, I was reading recently that in Delhi, in schools, there is sort of this bell that is rung sometimes to tell children to drink water every few hours. So it is a little bit difficult to also explain climate change and the risks of increasing heat to kids. And especially there's a lot of disparity between what's taught in private schools versus government schools and what they actually have access to. All right. Kirtiji, I saw you raise your hand, and Raghuji, you as well. Please go ahead.
No, I have with all the three presentations were absolutely remarkable, stunning. Thank you very much. I just wanted to kind of share two things. One in observation, and second a question. Observation is this. I was talking to someone about this webinar yesterday evening and telling him to attend this. He did this morning a very interesting thing. He did this morning, sent me a Gujarati newspaper, which says how many people are killed every year in Mumbai in the train accidents. Trains, not accidents, just a train, which manages 3.5 million people every day. And that newspaper story says that every year, something of the order of 2,700 people die in Mumbai alone. And then he asks a question, how many people die in Mumbai of heat wave or heat problem? The reason I'm asking this question is this. And of course, there's a parallel question that I asked myself that I know very well. I was working on this earthquake in Latur and Gujarat. Earthquake of 7.3 killed 10,000 people. Almost the same kind of earthquake kills 6 people in Japan. So the point essentially that these people are asking is this: don't we really have a much larger systemic, or whatever you want to call it, issue to look at? But that is no substitute for attending to what is being talked about today. But I think it's a very larger question, and I thought I'll ask that question to all of you. There's other small little thing that I want. There's a second thing is this, that because I have to leave, I'm catching a flight to Bangkok at 12 o'clock. Is this that, and I'm still in the office. Is this that I'm an architect, and when we do master planning and all that, there is a provision. There's a mandated provision that minimum 10% of the space should be kept as open space. I was just wondering, and I know what people do with it. I was just wondering, with this whole need for grading, the whole need for, I think, more trees, more green areas, water system, all that sort of a thing. Suppose you were to kind of change it and make it 20% open space. So for instance, I have two questions. Is there any study anywhere which would say what are the implications? Because land is very expensive. And any builder, anyone who does this is very concerned about this. As a matter of fact, we're always under pressure that even 10% you manage in such a way so that something is pushed here and something is pushed that. So, and I think master planning, I think as a matter of fact, India is going to build much more in the next 30 years than already has been built. That is what the situation is. And therefore, building bylaws, how much you build, how do you control, how do you kind of regulate is very important. And I was just wondering, whether there are any studies going on. Raghu Saab, is this something that we could do in Chennai in a specific situation? That just take an hypothetical case. Instead of 10%, it's a 20% open space requirement. What effect would it have? Not only on heat, but several other things. So one is the devil's advocate's question about so many people dying in Mumbai and in railway accidents. And second one is building bylaws and building regulations. Anyone who can answer. I will run away in 10 minutes any case, if, but please, I'm very keen to hear this.
Please go ahead, Raghuji. You're on mute.
Yeah. So two very quick responses since Kirtibai has to leave. The first is with regard to comparative deaths. Of course, I mean, this argument, the devil's advocate argument, you'll always hear. Why are you worried about this when so many people die of TB? Or why are you worried about this when so many people die of smoking? Left to me, I'll reduce deaths in every sphere. So let's tackle what we can tackle. And if we think back to the heat action plans, the first stated objective of the heat action plan is to reduce mortality due to heat. That is the first stated objective, to reduce mortality. The same objective was taken up in cyclones, for example, through early warning and through construction of cyclone shelters. And in the state of West Bengal and Odisha, the mortality due to cyclones has dropped like a ton of bricks. We used to have 800 deaths, 900 deaths in these two states. It has come down to deaths in single digits because of early warning, evacuating people and having good shelters with food, etc. By these measures, you've managed to reduce fatalities. So I think taking steps to reduce fatalities due to heat is also possible, and it would be a major help. But along with that, it would also help to reduce morbidity, because the same system which reduces death will also help people from falling ill, to recover from illness, to not get serious ailments, but to think. So I think it's worth an objective. In each area, we should try and target thing. I personally work on road accidents, for example, and the amount of deaths you have in road accidents is criminal. So I'll be doing work on that also, as well as on this. That's one. Second part was very interesting part that Kirtibai raised, which is on open air, open spaces inside buildings. Building laws vary by size, square yards, which you would know. The smaller the building gets, the less the open space is mandated. Because the idea is a smaller chap cannot have open space, he's already got so small. But is there a possibility at least of cross ventilation in those places? I'll just give you an example, and Kirtibai would be interested. One of the areas in Chennai where we are working with, there are multi-storied resettlement blocks where former slum dwellers have been shifted. These are 8-story buildings, and they are built with one row of 8-storied buildings, flats. Opposite them, another row of 8-storied building flats with a corridor running in between. So each flat only opens out to this corridor, not to an open space. And at the back, they open out to, they have a window which opens out into the back. But there is no cross ventilation. So we are in fact working with them to see whether there is a potential to have some cross ventilation built in through retrofit measures. Because that, I think, is the important issue here. Is there airflow? Is there cross ventilation possible, both for health as well as for heat, as well as for other measures? So that's just one thing, since he was interested in knowing what's happening in Chennai on this. This is one example we have come across.
Thank you, Raghuji.
I'm good to leave.
Thank you, Kirti. There's one question which is quite large in nature. which is what are the lessons that can be learned from your experiences? I think the idea has sort of been covered throughout all of the presentations, but if there are any last points that anybody would like to bring up as to what you see the way ahead to be.
I think one thing that I would love to say that's been the underpinning argument throughout my work, at least, and
Apekshita, louder, please.
why, I'm sorry, I don't know why my audio has been misbehaving today. I said that one thing that I would like to bring up, which has been the underpinning factor for the work of several organizations, is to sort of switch the lens with which we view heat waves. So instead of looking at it from a bottom-up perspective where we're trying to impose ideas and trying to impose policies on a vast majority of people who are impacted by heat, we need to try and bring them into the conversation. So we need to try and understand what kind of early warning systems will actually work for people. Perhaps when we asked construction workers and gig workers how do they consume their news, most of them did not say that they watch television news. So perhaps announcing heat waves on television is not the idea. Perhaps we need to think of SMS delivery for early warning systems. Perhaps we need to think of newer and more interesting ways in which we incorporate the voices of those who are most impacted and try to design solutions which have come from people who have been dealing with heat for millennia, for generations. We've always been a hot country. There are methods and practices that people have incorporated, such as holding a damp towel on their heads, drying wet bed sheets in their homes to deal with heat. Some of these measures need to be institutionalized, need to be funded, so that we're not again initiating rules and initiating policies that fall on deaf ears, that don't really result in any kind of implementation. So thinking of heat bottom up is what has been the biggest lesson for me during my work.
Please go ahead, Anumita. I see you have unmuted. Hello, I hope I'm audible. Anumita,
Yes, yes, Anumita, please go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, just a very brief point actually, because we have reiterated that again and again. But the point is, what I feel is that we have not yet understood quite well at the policy level that what it takes to design a climate resilient city. How do you design for resilience? So it can be heat today, it can be floods tomorrow, right? And therefore, we have not even, if you really look at all our guidelines related to built environment, right? They deal with structural safety, they deal with, to some extent, some of the environmental parameters. But that is more from the perspective of mitigation. So if you have water crisis in Chennai, do water harvesting to mitigate the problem. But we have not understood how do you design for resilience and adaptation. I think a lot more science will now have to come for that kind of policy making, and the basic rules of the game will have to change when we are doing infrastructure development.
Yes, I think I completely agree with you. So both the points that actually Apekshita and you have spoken about approach this problem from two different ends. One is understanding how heat is affecting people at the ground level, understanding how they are tackling it at the individual level, and what are the methods that they have been using and actually have come up with. And this is true. Heat, despite being an invisible disaster, is something we have dealt with all of our lives. And communities know how to deal with it. It's the risk of increasing heat stress, which is the problem, because we know it's getting hotter and hotter. And I think the way that you have put it, which is actually larger frameworks of what our cities need to look like to become more sustainable and resilient, is another entry point into it. And I think the way I see it is being able to bridge and combine both of these approaches into something that finally looks like an implementable and adequate heat action plan. All right, I'll leave the last word up to you, Raghuji. Okay, all right. Then I think we have reached the end of our webinar. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining in and presenting the work that you've been doing. It's super important, and as someone who's also involved with working with Heatwaves, I think any kind of work that's being done right now is very, very valid and very important. So thank you for coming, taking time out to present here. We thank all the participants who have joined in. We thank you for your questions. The webinar will be available on both INHAF's website as well as our YouTube channel. If anybody's missed out anything or you want to go look at the presentations again, please feel free to. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Anumita ma'am. Thank you, Apekshita.
Hi, Anumita. Sorry, I didn't say hi when we began.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Chitrakshi, do you want to end it?
Yes.